Welcome back to another episode of the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week I've got Dr. Rob Butler on the show. He is the Director of Performance for the St. Louis Cardinals. He spent some time at Duke University with Mike Krzyzewski and a whole bunch of other places. And he's going to lay down some solid information over the next hour. Take out your pen and notebook and start jotting it down. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. And here we go. Rob, thanks for coming on. I can't thank you enough. I'm excited to talk to you because you have got yourself a whole diverse background and being director of performance and physical therapist and all that with Major League Baseball, with St. Louis and all. How did you come up the ranks and what's your background?
Yeah, so I always, this is a discussion that I often start off to with someone like the high schoolers and college individuals I talk to is when I was going to high school and I was going to college, the job I currently have didn't exist very often, right? We were still very siloed with our healthcare. Even in professional sports, you had medical, you had strength conditioning. Strength conditioning wasn't necessarily standard for all professional sports, even during that time. So just something to consider and think about, just the evolving status of support services that will happen, in the future. So not to get people focused on, oh, that's my job. Well, your job may not exist yet, right? And
Good point.
And how great is that, right? So coming up through college, I was a well below average Division III college goalkeeper at Marietta College. So below average that I really loved coaching. And so during that time, I went to grad school. I knew I was interested in biomechanics, footwear specifically. At the time, this is the time where I'm literally going through the U.S. News and World Report, like telephone book they had to find who had biomechanics as a master's degree. Because my grades weren't super awesome. I got a little stuck on flowering plants, getting my BS in biology. And so Springfield College came up as a place where I had a good D3 connection. I did want to continue my work in coaching soccer, doing a GA there, getting a degree in biomechanics. And actually, it may have been the only place I got into. Just thinking about like the different options I had and where to go. And once again, I came from a small D3 school, and you were expected to go on and teach biology or something, and I was just different. Or we had an athletic training track, and I just was trying to get to biomechanics grad school as fast as possible. So fast forward on, complete my master's degree, working with Reebok, do some great work there with Jen Osif, trying to kind of think about how to increase actual propulsive forces, not worried about the impact, but more so how can midsole stiffness affect propulsive forces. And in the end, it really can if you just do normal running, which certainly makes sense now, whatever it is, almost 21 years later. But it was just a great experience for me to integrate into like the footwear design process and thinking about, we actually had to build in a force plate mount kind of between the straightaway of the track and the bend of the track. And so there was some project management stuff that I didn't anticipate going to grad school with, but fast forward there, I get a great opportunity to go to University of Delaware with Irene Davis and study, footwear and orthotics. End up doing a PhD looking at if we classify feet in a certain way, typical high arch, low arch, how does that interact with the shoes we would typically recommend them for from a biomechanical standpoint in a fresh state as well as fatigue state. But during that time, I really got into the notion of, or my grant funding that Irene procured was focused on using orthotics to improve osteoarthritis, knee osteoarthritis symptom presentation. And so the idea was, if you have this very varus knee angulation, could you almost like counterbalance the foot or evert the foot to offload that a little bit?
To bring it back into a more neutral position where it's not a varus or valgus.
Yeah, how much you bring it back into position. I think it was just like, can we maybe shift the center of pressure a little bit to take it off kind of that, that typical kind of rut that we see with the wearing of the articular cartilage. So my, when we think about graduate from PhD, you got to kind of develop your own line of research. I was like, all right, like these work with some people, but not with others. Some go on to total knees as expected. So who could this maybe benefit the most? And it gets me to post-op ACL, where we identify within 10 years, a vast majority have early OA symptoms. This is in 2005, starting to talk about this. I start getting very interested in like inflammatory biomarkers so maybe we can early identify those that need to be at greater risk. So I start going down the ACL wormhole, not from the jump landing mechanics, not from the prevention piece, but really from the post-operative standard of care piece. And I get to this point where I'm dealing with a lot more clinical work. And so I actually had an opportunity to go to UNC to do a postdoc where I could work with the Thurston Arthritis Center and Lee Callahan and Dr. Joanne Jordan there to learn about some of the biomarker stuff they were doing in a more rural population, but then also get some teaching experience there as well, which wasn't part of my PhD, and then finish that up. And I'm looking for, all right, what's my next step? And I think the piece that while I got my PhD in the physical therapy, or in the building of the physical therapy program at the University of Delaware, which obviously has great expertise and well-renowned, I didn't really have that clinical angle. And so my next step that was offered was a professor position at University of Evansville in Indiana, where I was a full-time professor, but also had a chance to get my DPT at the same time. And so going through classes and because they were actually going from their MPT to DPT, there's a little bit of offload of workload. And so I did that. Now at the same time, so I started a lab there, biomechanics lab there, about 1,500 square feet, get the main guts in there. And I meet these two professors that I work with, Kyle Kiesel and Phil Plisky, who's done a lot of those star excursion balance, why balance test research. And then Kyle Kiesel, who done this weird thing called the functional movement screen, that really let us take movement beyond a single joint, like we looked at biomechanically, and more accessible to like a rural population and whatnot. And so, so I get there, setting up the own lab, thinking about the own osteoarthritis initiatives, doing some gait work post-op ACL, making some progress there, finishing my DPT. But at the same time, I'm starting to identify, okay, we're starting to think about, okay, how can we identify these people early from a functional standpoint that may be associated with greater risk or some inflammatory biomarkers or whatnot. So still an area I was trying to get funding for, which is difficult at a smaller school. Mm-hmm. And it gets me to like, how do we discharge people from ACL rehab? And return to play was a big thing there. And in the end, it ended up with some sort of hop test. It ended up with some sort of isokinetic dynamometer. And then in the back of my head, I'm thinking, well, wait a second, as a coach, like, when does preseason work start? And when you think about the return to play for rehab, the fitness part of it or the skill specific part of it is like just hop into practice. Well, you know, more often than not, if you're at a high school or if you're at a college, there's some summer training program that you go through that we really rarely would see on a rehab standpoint, which just got me to think more like, what's this continuum we need to look at from a true readiness standpoint to say you're truly ready, you're truly fit, you're truly healthy. And yes, there may be a need for a gait analysis at some point in time down the road. Once again, we're thinking like 2008, 2009, we weren't able to do biomechanics on a cell phone yet. Like, I don't even think I had an iPhone yet. I think it was still like iPhone 1, 2.
Sure.
And so there was still, and please don't, all the Apple people don't blow me up for not knowing the dates there on the iPhone, but I was definitely a late adopter. And so I was struggling with the access of biomechanics to the clinical setting, because you're talking about a $250,000 hardware investment. You're talking about a $75,000 plus benefits staff investment to turn around things in days, not like hours, not minutes. And certainly now where we see it's gone, it's, you know, it's much more accessible. And now we're just dealing with reliability and planes that actually provide more consistency of data and validity and whatnot. But at the time, that bridge was harder for me to envision.
Sure.
And so it basically, in the end, even when we think about that continuum of fitness, we still get this random allotment of, well, I want people to jump one leg as far as the other leg. But it wasn't as standard as, I mean, honestly, like a lot of what I come back to is like a second grade reading curriculum, right? Like there's a reason why you go to the next level book, right? If you're going up the alphabet of book order, like, and you start on B, once you are proficient enough, you go to C and then D, and then eventually it's, you know, small novels and other things, right? And so
a rubric, we need a rubric,
like a curriculum, right? A structure to go through. And so that's where I found myself just talking a lot about. And at the time, Phil, Kyle, and myself were lucky enough to, and actually Kyle collaborated with Deidre Tahan at the time on some ultrasound imaging things, and then came back around to, well, we're actually looking at musculoskeletal injury prevention in the military due to the national security concern that it has due to the days lost. Could we tie in some of the things that they were more prone to, the functional movement screen, the Y balance test, and other things of that nature, combined with some foot stuff that I had a background in. But the idea was more of a holistic view of an individual as opposed to one test as we think about bringing them in for a physical assessment. And so that got me down the pathway of like, okay, how do we tie in this continuum of patient care to biomechanics? And the idea that we very rarely find someone with alterations in biomechanics where we don't see reduced lower extremity power, reduced range of motion, like there were faster things we could take care of from a clinical setting, as opposed to waiting on the really ultra precise results of this controlled movement in a laboratory experiment that would really expedite patient care and performance goals. And so that's where during my time, so after I left Evansville after finishing my DPT, and after a year after that, I had the opportunity to go to Duke University. And so now I'm part of this large Research One medical center,
Nice.
but not your typical DPT goes to PhD, they do a pod, they get the pod scholarships, they got the next level early investigate. Like I stuck more into like, hey, let's publish and let's figure this piece out, as opposed to kind of going into a traditional grant cycle and whatnot, and did a lot more consulting with different sports. NFL, baseball was the majority that I spent my time with.
Why was that? Just
That
out of
would have
curiosity, being a
been-
soccer fan, why
yeah,
baseball?
so it's the group that was at the time was most open to talking about leveraging information. And honestly, if you think about probably the sport that's been developed or innovative as most often information, like it's probably baseball, because they have so many stats and it's so many games that it's probably been the leader in including data to drive discussions, right? To inform maybe best decisions or best practices. And so, so this would have been 2011, 2010. And starting to think about, hey, listen, like let's not think about everything is good or everything is bad, but like what are the decisions we make? What's the curriculum we look like? How do we adjust and adapt to optimize just general athleticism, not even thinking about the skill development piece? And so that led to very similar discussions, and we had some interaction with some Premier League teams at the time, some interactions with the NBA, but it was still back to, yes, we can do the biomechanics, yes, we can do the EMG, yes, we can do the isokinetic dynamometer, but oh yeah, by the way, his knee doesn't even get straight. Or, oh, by the way, this ankle and hip don't really move a lot, and so this may be why the knee is taking on a little bit more load than we see biomechanically. So, because we always, when we would see people at the lab, the idea was not for us to follow them wherever they went, but for us to have them in for a couple days, check them out, and then send them back to their team so that they could replicate and progress whatever the plan was, and not necessarily have to come back to the lab for a reevaluation. Our goal is that we never see you again and you're playing at the highest level and back to where you were. But it very rarely came down to, this is your biomechanics we really need to analyze. It was typically joint doesn't work well, not strong, asymmetry movement, or just just below standard movement. That may be a driver of the recurrence of injury or the injury you're seeing, and have this enable the staff to support the athlete and all the best to you. And
But what was that like to just draw away from the symptom-centric approach of rehab into a more integrated force production, how the joint relationships here affect here? What was that like for you? Did you have to unlearn a tremendous amount and then everything's chaos until everything kind of settles down and makes sense for you? What was that like?
I think it was funny. Deidre Tahan, one of the I stole one of her lines, that she was a recovering biomechanist, and I used that as well. And to me, what that means is I just had to think. I mean, I was talking to Kyle, and he's like, just to be clear, like, you want us to look at the squat and you just want us to look at the knee joint biomechanically. It's like, yeah, what else are we going to do? Well, we have this thing called the movement screen. It's not perfect, but it lets us look at the pattern in a bigger picture. And I was like, well, you realize that sucks because it's subjective. And he said, well, I just think it's different. And I think that what we're trying to accomplish are two different things. You're trying to tell me that a 5-degree difference in knee range of motion is the main driver behind what you're seeing. I'm trying to suggest that I'm trying to think about what can we enable with this person as opposed to what can we impair them with. And so that was part of my initial just discussion of thinking about, as opposed to adding so many negatives on, where can we start to grow the good that may actually help us in the long run, not change behavior at the time, but really lead to more positive discussion about what we can do, maybe what we should stay away from, but then think about treating the individual, the athlete, as more of a human and a health care system, as opposed to more of a sick care system. And discussions with Kyle, Greg Cook, Lee Burton, Brett Jones, like that functional movement group was very integral to my knowledge of just thinking about things differently. And then obviously Phil with some of the wide balance work, and then Greg Rose with the skill acquisition piece. Like, I've been very fortunate to be around people that tolerated my slow adaptation to just think differently about how to connect as opposed to how to isolate. And I think that was really from a learning standpoint, that's what it was for me is, hey, let's not worry about this knee abduction moment. Let's think about the human and what can be driving that to really holistically care for and give the person options, as opposed to say, you know what, this is all you got. And that just felt like a more, not initially, right? Initially, I just thought it was just hocus pocus. But then after you see the cases come through, you see the discussions, you see people not feel like they have hope, but think about the options of their health and the bigger picture of that. It certainly has allowed for more progress as opposed to inhibited, the health of individuals.
That's good to hear, Rob. And for the listening audience, if you go into our archives, you'll get episodes with Lee Burton and Greg Rose, for that matter, if you want to check those out. But the FMS has been around since the late 90s, when I think there were 12 screens initially that got tapered down into 7 primary screens. And then the SFMA came out. And I bring this up because you've been doing this long enough where the FMS has continually matured, as well as the SFMA. But as two, so have you. Mm-hmm. And so what is your perspective, and how do you utilize such screening process compared to when you first began exploring it to where you are now? How has that evolved?
Well, so I think, listen, early on, when, we were trying to sort through some of the early stuff, it was, composite scores and cutoff scores and all this business, which I think at the time we thought there was a better way to do it. And talking to Kyle and thinking about some other things with Phil and Mike Lair. And then the initial step being like, okay, is there a subset of small tests, and does everything get weighted equally, which was our first really poor attempt at the 100-point screen. But I think that the spirit of it, the part that I think that that's developed in me as a result of working around Phil and Kyle, and Greg Rose is the gold standard is to consistently get better. Like, when we think about what we're trying to do here, there's always going to be something new that comes on board. There's always going to be a different way of doing it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's better. Learning about how things can impact what you're doing and how they drive the player, staff, human interaction to create behavior change or to create program change, that's what we're striving for. Just don't get stagnant in the fact this is the exact same set of movements that we've had historically, that it's the exact same, that the language has to be the same. And so when I came onto the Cardinals, the first goal was just, okay, so now that we have this group that's going to be working together across medical, across strength and conditioning, across sports science, thinking about supplementation, thinking about rehab, we got to create a common language so that we're all on the same page. And coming from a movement background or functional movement systems background, some of the words didn't mesh up, or some of the history didn't mesh up. So I believe, for example, like we had a strong DNS background that was inherent, and they were really good at leveraging that system, which fits inside when we think about the SFMA or how we build up exercise. But the idea of like mobility limitations or deficits doesn't exist in that framework, or so I was educated. I was like, all right, well, hey, let's not let the word get in the way of what we're trying to do, because what we're trying to do is communicate, period. And so when I say a word, I just need you to understand, we need to understand it's the same thing. That's it. So that we're not confusing who we're working with, whether it's a staff member, whether it's the front office, whether it's the player, whatever. Like, we got to be saying the same thing. That's what we're going to initially value. And so then finding about, okay, like, we don't like mobility, we don't like that, we don't like motor control can mean too many things based upon history. Okay, what if we just go back down to active and passive limitation? Like, anyone have a problem with that? And do we all agree that if we have an active limitation or a passive limitation, that we'll treat them differently, or we can typically make progress differently? And so, like, all right, so where's the overlap? Where's the synergy of ideas here to create the common place that we can move forward with as a group, so this athlete feels like they're taken care of across all different levels? And while that's helpful at the big league club, I'm really fortunate to have leadership that was like, hey, listen, the major league club isn't as much of the priority as far as figuring out what the next steps is. It doesn't mean you don't support the major league club, but understand there's just more degrees of freedom there. There's more nuances there. Players have their own connections, and it just takes more time. So, but when we think about what happens on the lower levels, that's where there's less resources, so we can be the resource for them to figure out what the future culture can be. And so I was very fortunate to have that support. I feel very lucky to be able to take our time to get those things right, and then start to build on that. And so that's where it was more from my background. It was the idea of like, hey, we're going to continue to get better. We don't have the answer. We'll never have the answer. And it's really difficult at times to think about that there's not an end to this road. Like, even if there's like, I still remember it was very interesting. Before I got into the team, I was talking with Jeff Head, who was with the San Francisco Giants. He's now with Cincinnati. And they had, because he was trying to set up, I think it was like 2012 or 2013, the winter meetings. He was talking about setting up kind of some sports science structure within the Giants. And whichever one year it was, they won their first world championship or of that group. And I said, so what's the goal? He's like, the goal is to win another one next year. And so there's always this, what's the dynasty look like? So there's always learning, there's always development involved, and just don't think that there's one way to figure this out. We need to be continuing out what are the options that we can support and figure this out with the athlete together, because that's when we get our best outcomes.
Sure, that makes complete sense. Okay, so with your background, first, it would do a disservice to Springfield College if I just didn't put my fist up in the air and go, whoa, what is with Springfield College, by the way? It's like, I swear 50% of my guests have had some connection or have studied at that small Western Massachusetts college that is kind of a juggernaut, like, was it East Appalachian University in the 80s was. Springfield has just come on the scene and have generated such unbelievable talent. I just have to pause and say, wow, great job, Springfield College. But your background with the feet and with shoe wear and your intrigue with foot mechanics and biomechanics, how does that carry over into these other screenings? Like the Y balance I could get, because you're looking at balance and therefore from the ground up. But many of the other screenings don't actually take into consideration anything other than the degree of dorsiflexion. Sure. As far as, so sure. Do you blend some of your background knowledge into that? Have you kind of come up with your own recipe while using these screening process with your own background?
All right. Well, first, don't go beating up dorsiflexion. There's a lot of power in that dorsiflexion, right?
Oh, heck yeah. No, I'm not beating anything up. I love the foot, just for, I have a bit of a fetish myself.
All right. Well, I'd imagine so. Staying on a board, it's what you got to look at. So here's the interesting piece of it. And I still go back to, we have a good understanding that, once again, Tom Veronic and all his wisdom. I still remember working in the Athlete's Foot store in Concord Mall in Wilmington, Delaware, up 202. And him telling me in my ear that we're going to match this foot type, that's this shape plus this. And once we put these shoes together, then like no injuries are going to pop up. It wasn't that dramatic, but that's what it felt like to
okay. All right.
I mean, it felt that simple when, and in the end, like I start doing my literature search and microfiche, microform, like that's when this happened, right?
Talking my language.
And
all right.
so, and I'm like, and I'm just like, there's nothing here to support that notion. There's nothing here about one being really good at classifying arch structure, being really good at classifying, like it's just this story that we've manufactured that listen, logically, it makes all the sense in the world. But I think, I mean, honestly, right now, I feel like we're just getting to the point, and we had some interesting work coming out of the military side that I think still being worked on. But the idea that, listen, you can classify a static arch type, but how does that arch perform when it's under dynamic load? Which is when we have these injuries that we believe are associated with these overuse concerns that runners have. And so
you could have a foot that presents as a high rigid arch when in truth, when it's loaded, it's actually floppy and it just
100%.
rests in a high arch. So that's going to have a completely different outcome from the one that's rigid. So to create types like that, I get you. It doesn't make sense.
And so I think that that's an important piece that is still evolving and still needs to be worked on. The second piece of it is when you look at the injury prevention literature related to footwear, the thing that's come up now, honestly, in the past decade is the shoes that prevent injury are the most comfortable ones. And so I think, and Nike's actually probably kind of moved back on the world stage as far as some of the injury prevention literature related to the shoe. And certainly they put down their moonshot challenge of trying to have a shoe that kind of reduces all injuries or takes away all injuries. But I really think that, we're still moving decades later to shoes that have durometers that are different for females versus males based upon, I mean, simple things that you think, the idea that women are just not scaled down version of men, like why this has taken so long. It's just due to manufacturing efficiency. It's not due to how we would actually respect the biomechanics or the physiology or the anthropometrics of an individual or work with them. So we'll do some of those things now, but it's not, we still are very consistent on looking at dorsiflexion as an overall measure of athlete health and kind of lower extremity degrees of freedom, just to think about the pieces that it takes into account. We use kind of a half kneeling approach to just track kind of tibial position. We're very specific to the collapsing of the medial aspect of the foot to normalize that. Now it is typically kind of comes up as if something presents as overuse and we can think about interacting with the shoe in such a way that it's meaningful, then we tend to move in that direction. But it's not really a primary, because it's not the most common mechanism or driver of injuries we see. And the other piece of it is when you think about baseball shoes, cleats, it's a very limited market. I think that if there are, I've had a couple discussions and, you have very rigid heel counters, you have very tight spaces, you have like 3 different types based upon, what quote unquote type of player they are. There isn't the adaptability that you see from certainly a running shoe form. And listen, a large part of that is you can only sell baseball shoes for the sport. You can't sell baseball shoes for football. You can't sell baseball shoes for lacrosse because the steel structure in the front limits it to the sport that's associated with, and as a result limits the R&D, the adaptability of the R&D dollars. And so it's understandable, but I really think that a lot of what baseball cleats end up with is some derivative of and hybrid of what either it's tends to be football or track kind of coming together. And so you get these really rigid heel counters, which I think can limit your options as far as how to adjust the shoe. But we do have, we have a lot of discussions about what do the top speed guys look like? What do they look like in, really for more of our younger players, it's, they come up and they've got the cool shoes that they want to wear. And it's like, well, hey, is speed a tool of yours? Yeah. Well, just understand when you look at what the top guys do stealing bases in Major League Baseball, the majority are wearing low cut shoes.
Mm-hmm.
What's that about? Well, when you wear a higher cut shoes, it's harder to get that extra degree of freedom from dorsiflexion. You get your shin angle the right way, to get your forward projection the right way. And we're dealing with milliseconds here, and you want every millisecond possible. So just something to think about. I'm not telling you what to do, but when you look at what the best of the best do, which is actually and I'm sure Greg brought this up on his call with you, but I still remember being out in Titleist one time, and Greg had a player come in who had some was very worried about his short game, but had some off-brand wedges that he'd found on some tour stop. And Greg just said, listen, I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm just telling you the best of the best have name brand wedges that are the best of the best in their wedge game have name brand wedges. I don't know if that's coincidence or sponsorship, but that may be something to consider when you think about trying to maximize what this look is, looking at what the best of the best do. So anyway, kind of converging. So when we think about now related to how do we look at the foot, it's more on a case by case basis, and certainly we'll look at foot structure, other components of it, but it's not as much of a primary driver. A lot of it honestly is comfort, right? Just due to being on their feet for the long period of time, the number of days in a row. And so thinking about what enhances that comfort without taking away the kind of the efficient connection with the ground, that is really helpful from a quick twitch or power standpoint.
Yeah, I'm curious if there must be, I just haven't found it, research studies about comfortable shoes, where they took a number of participants and found shoes that they felt are the most comfortable, and then actually looking at the structure of their foot, comparing it to the shoe in which they chose, and gaining information, really kind of valuable information as to when the foot is in this position. I mean, we're talking 26 bones, 33 joints, right, 3 arches, 3 points of contact, primarily where they should be under the first, fifth met heads and the calcaneus, but that's going to shift based on the foot shape itself. And therefore the support that it's going to encapsulate itself in is going to have to vary too. So you didn't happen to stumble over anything like that, any research like that, have you?
Well, so the interesting thing for me is the piece that's led the most to looking at injuries is actually not even worrying about foot structure right now, and going more towards thinking about just in general what leads to it and leads to reduced injuries, and that's due to comfort and also obviously training plans, right? So when we think about what to balance out or looking at from a injury standpoint, the foot can have a role. Everything has a role. But I think when, is that the first thing you would necessarily go to? Well, there's probably some other dominoes to knock out of the way to make sure those are right before kind of going down that pathway.
Such as?
Well, no, just like I said, training volumes, right? What's your plan right now? Like, what's your cross training look like? What's your, what's your nutrition look like? What's your recovery look like? Those kinds of things, you can get the best orthotic if, depending upon where you feel about it, you can do your best at trying to manage the ground foot interaction as much as you can. You can get biomechanical data all you want to, but in the end, if those big rocks are taken care of, there's only a certain amount of impact that you can make on the from that standpoint.
I got you. Okay, so just within your position, what are the highlights, and what gets you up in the morning? Just sure. I don't want to switch gears too much, but I'm just curious for the listening audience. There's a lot of aspiring strength coaches, athletic trainers, physical therapists that would like to work in professional sports. But what are the things that get you out of bed? What are the highlights of your position?
I think the exciting thing, we talked about this culture as it relates to kind of internally. Our performance department is not just strength and conditioning. It really, as I said, goes across medical. It goes across medical from an injury prevention standpoint, and then all the minor league medical is something that I'm responsible for. And then nutritional supplementation, sports science. Yes, we have a common language here, but now it's more of, okay, how do we bridge that gap to the coaching side, right? And we really think about, more of a total curriculum structure, about how to support these individuals and giving them, what are the couple of things they got to work on, as opposed to every group of expertise having their laundry list of, hey, you've got to get better at X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's a lot. And I think that, how do we become really consistent with our messaging? How do we become consistent with what we're trying to go after? And then also take into account the players' input as well. Once the kind of the staff, coaching as well as performance, kind of get together to figure out what are the main rocks we want to take care of. But then, the emotion of the players, I think kind of that next step of providing that inclusive model of really bettering the overall development process. And so I think that those are the next steps that we're really trying to take, is connecting the coaching staff to connect better with the players, really who is the individual that we're trying to maximize what they currently have and what they will be in the future, to really let them know this is what's going to take you to the next level. And so that's really where we're focusing our attention from a development and day-to-day standpoint, where we're consistently trying to think about how to take that next step of betterment.
Gotcha. So I see there being big buckets in your world of sports science. One being recovery, and that may involve sleep patterns. And then you've got nutritional support and guidance for fueling. And then, of course, there's the training conditioning realm of the physical frame. Yep. Am I right on with that? Or are there other big buckets that may be in those kind of in that realm?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, we talk about what can we do in the hours outside the game to prepare you for the next one. Right. And so all that goes into that.
And curious, for those that are coming up toward the big show and compared to those that are already in the majors, do you see that there is more or less interest on average amongst the athletes? Like those that really want to get up there, are they going to strive harder and listen to everything that you say compared to those that have been doing it for a while? Or what do you think?
I think as you get closer, you get a little more motivated about what the different things you can do to get there are. I think there's some truth in that. And I think that the way that we really try to present information is to be as transparent as possible. And that even deals with the technologies we look at or integrate from a wearable standpoint or anything else, is we really try, early on, we started to, 6-7 years ago, when the workload trackers kind of came on board, one of the first things we did in our collaborations was, hey, listen, we love the product, we love your app, but you've got to turn off these features because I can't explain this. Yeah. I need to be honest with your black box is great for you, but it really hurts our connection and communication with the player about being honest with them about what they're looking at. So often we have these discussions. It's still very much so we're looking to get consistency of doing something that moves the needle forward for that player. But the main thing is not necessarily making it ultra fancy or ultra elite or ultra special, but it's making it something that we can consistently monitor, value, track to guide the player with where they're at. And so, certainly. It tends not to be the nth order exponent of this derivative of the time signature of the heart rate variability during the 17th wake sleeps. Like it's more often than not, what's this basic thing that you're just not being as consistent with that we can monitor tomorrow and then the next day and the next day. Because a lot of when we think about our communication with the players and staff and front office, we really want to, and everyone talks about this, we want to maximize the signal to noise ratio, right? And so what does that mean? Well, we need to have things that are reliable or consistent from a day-to-day basis, that we're not like, well, that difference is due to variability in just a sensor, or monitoring device or whatever. Like, yes, there's some variability, but if the variability involved trumps the conversation, then what are we really trying to provide there? It's a lot of lost energy of trying to understand how to track that meaningful marker. But then, like as I mentioned earlier, like yes, it's got to be reliable, but then we have to be inside our own department. We have to be consistent to the validity we believe it to have, and what's that definition mean? And very rarely is it mean, unless it's like range of motion, which that's nice if it's range of motion because that's really simple for people to understand. But when you have things like speed, or you have things like sleep cycle or sleep latency, sleep duration, like what is that exact term, so that we're not confusing to anyone else what we're actually talking about. And then, and I know this is maybe ultra simple, but the validity we have has to be understood by the player. Because if we say a term and then they think it's something entirely different, then we've lost our way. And maybe that's just due to their bias. Maybe it's because it's someone in their back pocket that they connect with or they trust is telling them it means something different. Well, we're just saying what it means to us, and this is how we're going to target this going forward. And then I think the next piece is, honestly, sometimes those conversations aren't as simple as like, hey, this is a happy discussion. So how do we manage the emotional response of sharing that information such that it allows for progress and doesn't allow for some sort of regression related to the relationship, which then affects the communication? Because in the end, all we're trying to do is efficiently develop relationships so that they trust us with supporting them with this additional information. Because we're on their team trying to get the most help them get the most out of what they have as a professional baseball player.
I could totally see that. With the advent of more technology comes more noise if you're not careful.
Yep.
And you can follow the rabbit all the way down to Wonderland. But
Yep.
With that technology, Rob, is there one that just say, this is the one, if I let go of everything else, and not to get any of the other companies in trouble, which the one that's your go-to that gives you the most information with the least amount of noise?
So I think that I think that if you had a way to track the heart rate response over 24 hours for a long period of time, that probably gives you your best information. And then certainly if you could do something related to impacts and the magnitude of those impacts, that's the next step from a kind of layered standpoint. But when we think about what that looks like or how the body responds, do we get down to a deep enough heart rate related to deep sleep in the middle of the night? What is the range that we work through from a pregame standpoint? Certainly heart rate tracking in game is there aren't a large amount of companies that you can actually do that with that the players feel comfortable wearing. So that's not something we kind of do on a day-to-day basis, and nothing at all related to from a big league standpoint. But I think that's the meaningful information that does have, in our experience, kind of the best connection with the individual, because you have a time component. You can look at recovery, like, hey, listen, I know you were training hard, but like, look how long it took you to get back to your baseline of just rest when you were sitting at your locker. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying this is, when we think about areas, we think about getting you ready between innings, this is the thing we want to see kind of controlled better. So can we look into some strategies related to changing that, or related to kind of that recovery process? And once again, those are lower level discussions. Those come off on the one-off as player needs arise. But I think that if you had that type of information, that could really lead to some really good insights from a player standpoint, staff standpoint, thinking about where to guide a player's energies and efforts.
Makes complete sense. That's great. Well, we're coming up to the end of the episode here, and I've got just really one or two more questions. You're in the Carolina area, are you not?
That's right.
How excited are you to have yourself a brand new football club in regards to Major League Soccer? Have you been to any of the matches?
I haven't had time yet to go to any matches, but certainly, that Charlotte region, having finally getting something related to soccer certainly seems like a long time coming. Now, granted, I know they've had some of the lower level clubs have been there for a bit, but seeing what I think it was for, I think it was 2014 or 2015. I saw Paris Saint-Germain there against Real Madrid, and see the Bank of America Park filled up like that, you could just tell there was a good environment. And pre MLS, actually, when back when one of the first international matches I saw domestically was Manchester United versus Barcelona up at the Lincoln Financial Field in Philadelphia, and it had that very similar vibe of a city that was ready to take on and support that type of professional environment for a while. So very interested to see kind of how that goes, and certainly hope they can sustain that. And fingers crossed that they'll actually end up with their own stadium at some point down the road, because I think that'll be a very unique environment with all the different areas. And certainly, the thing that I get excited about the most and is having the kids see what that looks like and be inspired from an activity standpoint, athleticism standpoint. Certainly there's really this nasty side that's happening in youth sports now, but I think for the average kid to see that on a day-to-day basis, I mean, the fact that I've got 2 or 3 young children and 2 girls that are now into sports, and I can turn on Hulu and find a women's volleyball match from Wisconsin or whatever, or even a women's basketball game or WNBA at any point in time. Access to that and seeing that live, I think, can be such an inspirational component for the youth to really drive them to more and more activity, so they can think about these sports as really lifelong components of their day-to-day activity. And so the more Charlottes we get, I think the better off we're going to be as a country and as a world, without a doubt.
Oh, heck yeah. We got San Jose Quakes here, the Earthquakes, although they're at the bottom of the standings in the West right now.
Hey, you've had your time.
Stadium.
You've had your time.
But the stadium's always packed.
Yeah,
it doesn't
those
matter.
San Jose guys, no, you can't now. No.
Yeah. Okay, then the last question is World Cup, November.
Yep.
It's only a couple months away.
Yep.
US, do we have a chance?
There's always a chance. You're in it, right? That's all you look
Good
for.
man.
You're always a chance. You're in it. I listen. I love the club. I love what Pearl is doing. I think it'll just be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think the timing of it's going to be interesting.
So you're not rooting for England. You're going to root for the US when it comes to our bracket.
Oh, I don't think that's not even a question.
All right, good. Well, I didn't know how
question.
strong you were with the British Premier League.
No. Listen. I still got the Tony Meola jerseys, like from the early, like, I mean, I grew up in those, trying to play in those things. Granted, I always joke that if I would have been a couple inches taller, I would have been the domestic version of Schmeichel. But listen, I grew up with with Meola, with Keller, like those are my heroes, with Timmy Howard. And so listen, It's USA all the way. Very excited to see what we can do. I think we're going to make a run for it. And hey, listen, we're in it. And I think we get out of the first round, and then we'll see what magic happens after that. But it's going to be intriguing how these rosters get managed, certainly with the league calendars kind of wrapping around them. And it's going to be chess, not checkers, for some of these international managers, without a doubt.
Good point. Well, Rob, this has been great. I really appreciate your time, and wish you the best for the remainder of the season with baseball, and a nice off season eventually coming. And so it's perfect timing for World Cup too. You can just kick back and watch a whole bunch of matches.
Yeah, that'll be right in the middle of our off-season camp, so it'll be good to have that as a thing to balance it against. But hey, Rocky, thanks for having me on, and I look forward to more discussions in the future.
Right on.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Zealous Podcast. I don't know about you, but I feel like I just drank out of a fire hydrant. I might have to play that back at slow-mo and just pick up all the information Dr. Butler shared with us. I want to thank him, as well as the Cardinals organization, for allowing him to come on the podcast. And until next time, check out those archived podcast episodes I had with Dr. Greg Rose from the Titleist Performance Institute, as well as Lee Burton, one of the co-founders or co-creators of the Functional Movement Screen. Have a great week.